I think many of the key issues that you're considering at this conference are hugely important ones, thinking about the role of our universities, of academic research, and about exactly what constitutes higher education. Earlier this week, I helped to launch the Free University of Brighton. And for those of you who've not yet come across this initiative with its strapline, Education for Love, Not Money, it's an attempt to create a framework for an alternative to the current system of education, one that's accessible to all, regardless of income. Free University Brighton asks anyone who can teach something to others for free to get in touch, and they'll publicise what's on offer. And if you're interested in learning something, you simply book a place. And if you have an interest in learning something that's not yet available, then Free University Brighton will advertise to try to fill that gap. Early examples include 2 students learning script writing at the Brighton Unemployed Centre for Families project. Their teachers were a performance writer and a former probation officer, and another tutor who used to write scripts for EastEnders. One of the students is on incapacity benefit and so can't afford adult education. The other is a volunteer at Brighton Unemployed Centre. And the opportunities advertised have also included a knitting group at Hove Library and Sussex University's philosopher teaching about the end of history. So there is a wide spectrum here. And it's proving hugely successful and meeting a clear need for community-based, continuing, accessible learning. And so is that what the future of education looks like? Well, certainly the current economic climate is one in which, for many in education, you have to pay for education. It's for many an unaffordable luxury, and that's been compounded by cuts to adult education, and of course by the government's decision to lift the cap on tuition fees. A university education is genuinely beyond the reach of many potential students. And you'll recall that the changes to tuition fees were hugely controversial. They were passed by only 21 votes in the House of Commons. Opponents like myself argued that the impact would be fewer students entering higher education, and that certainly seems to be borne out by early evidence. Last summer, the Independent Commission on Fees said the increase in tuition fees had resulted in a noticeable drop in the number of English students applying for university places during the academic year, with a shortfall of around 15,000 applicants compared with the number that would usually be expected. Almost 6 out of 10 sixth formers who opted not to go straight to university did so primarily because of worries about fees, according to a study by a commercial arm of The Guardian. Part-time students, who make up 30% of the undergraduate population, have been especially hard hit. In 2012, part-time student enrolments were down significantly compared with the previous year, by as much as 30% at some universities. And I also warned that higher tuition fees would discourage the less well-off from going to university, turning our campuses into elite access-only areas. And youngsters in affluent areas are 5 times more likely to go to university than in the poorest areas, and that inequality is only getting worse. What's more, those students that do overcome the financial obstacles are increasingly being forced to work at the same time in order to get by, throwing into question the quality of some of that higher education experience. There's been a knock-on effect for universities, both the newer ones and the Russell Group institutions alike. A University and College Union report, Universities at Risk, also shows just how devastating the rise in tuition fees will be for the economy, for example, here in Brighton and the South East. The finding that a 30 million cut to the University of Brighton's teaching budget, for example, could result in an additional £36 million loss to the regional economy. Those kinds of figures, I think, are quite staggering. All of which puts universities under more and more pressure to save money elsewhere, or indeed to attract more students from overseas. But that latter option has itself become a lot more difficult as the result of the government's immigration policies, which is now really targeting students on the basis that they might overstay and therefore pose a risk to overall immigration targets. That seems to me to be massively misguided. There is very, very little evidence at all that students are overstaying their visas. And this draconian response, I think, has been absolutely out of proportion to the risks. And that's why I've backed calls for students to be removed from net immigration figures. Now, the government has slashed 80% of its university teaching budget in line with Lord Brown's recommendation that the bulk of recurrent funding for teaching in English universities be replaced by higher tuition fees. But that is not an isolated hit, as you all know. For example, universities have also lost a further £682 million in so-called efficiency savings from teaching, research and infrastructure budgets. We're told that the cuts are needed to reduce the cost to the public purse, but that really doesn't stack up. Like so much of the coalition's austerity agenda, slashing spending on higher education is, I would argue, economically illiterate. The new tuition fee system saves the government almost no money, especially in the short term. The state still has to loan students their fees up front, and in reality, the vast scale of student debt will mean that a significant proportion of graduates actually never pay it back. The Institute for Fiscal Studies figures estimate the total saving to the taxpayer of the reform represents just a 12% taxpayer saving on the previous system, whilst a slightly higher repayment cost or a slightly greater inflationary effect than the most optimistic model used in those calculations would actually mean that the present policy is more expensive than the one it replaced. In other words, the idea that privatising income streams in universities was ever about keeping the economy afloat was discredited almost as soon as it was put forward. Now, in the current context, the options that remain open to universities are increasingly limited, and frankly, I don't think that's by accident. Tuition fees, the slashing of teaching and other budgets, and other so-called reforms, I believe, were actually intended to prepare the ground for another onslaught in the remorseless process of commercialisation of our lives and our public institutions, with universities forced into compliance if they want to compete to survive. The government set out its plans in an education white paper that promoted competition between higher education institutions as a way of allowing for profit companies to move aggressively into the sector. It sets out a frightening vision of a future in which competition and profit rule the sector. For example, universities would be ranked according to graduate employment rates and salaries, even though the government's mismanagement of the economy means that wages are depressed and job opportunities for young people are few and far between. The idea, of course, was supposedly to give students choice. Yet the reality for the majority of students is that choice is determined primarily by how much going to university is going to cost them in fees and in other costs, and including whether they can actually afford to live away from home. If you're a postgraduate, that choice is even more limited, with over 2/3 of postgrads having to self-fund and fees going up, whilst the ability to access resources like bank loans is on the decline. The white paper also planned the introduction of a concept that strikes fear into the heart of anyone who's seen what's going on in places like the United States, the concept of any willing provider. The UK has a world-class reputation, yet this will be fundamentally undermined if the principle of any willing provider in the HE sector is allowed to take root. Surely any education system worth its salt should be concerned with qualified providers at the very least. And the model that the government favours doesn't work either. If you look at the experience of the US, only 1 in 5 students graduate from some for-profit institutions with a degree. All have a high level of publicly subsidised debt, and there's also evidence of mis-selling of qualifications to vulnerable students and their families. The evidence from the US suggests that private for-profit models could have precisely the opposite consequences to those stated. In other words, they will drive down quality and value for money. They'll burden students with debts acquired whilst obtaining credentials of sometimes little value, and ultimately pass on much of the cost to the taxpayer while enriching only private investors and company executives. What's more, as we know from bitter experience, as soon as the private sector gets its hands on our public resources, there is an enormous potential for it to asset strip. And so it's crucial that there are strict controls on the ability of any higher education institution receiving public funding to dispose of assets. Moreover, whilst the Higher Education Bill may have been scrapped in spring 2012, the threat of privatisation and competition has not receded. And in fact, it's becoming a fast-moving reality at Sussex as well as elsewhere. At the University of Sussex, as you'll know, plans to privatise catering, estates and facilities management may well be the thin end of the wedge. The proposals threaten pensions, pay, conditions and job security, not to mention the quality and price of services, including in sensitive areas like security and health and safety. Yet union reps report that alternatives to outsourcing appear not to have been openly considered, and the idea that privatisation can improve quality and reduce costs seems to have been uncritically accepted, despite abundant evidence to the contrary. Moreover, by putting the market at the heart of higher education rather than the student, privatisation undermines the very essence of the role of education. So when the coalition lifted the cap on tuition fees and saddled individual students with debt, they failed to recognise that education actually benefits society as a whole, not just the individual student. Indeed, in the parliamentary debate on tuition fees, the focus was almost entirely on the likely impact of the proposed fee increases on individual students and potential students from different backgrounds. Now that, of course, is important, but there are also larger questions about the university's contribution to the common good, about the health and breadth of Britain's public realm, and those questions in that debate were hardly asked at all. Yet university should be, and has been, a place where young people have learnt to think critically, to question assumptions, to see the world and themselves in new ways, to grow. In helping students to develop in this way, universities have served public purposes, defined by a concept of the public good. They have belonged, by definition, firmly to the public realm. Yet the coalition has sought quite deliberately to change all that, to remove universities from the public domain and transfer them to the market domain instead. The university is to become a kind of supermarket or shopping mall, satisfying individual wants. The very words public good have disappeared from the higher education policymakers' lexicon. And all of this isn't happening in a vacuum. It's situated in that broader context which this government is setting out, that neoliberal context in which everything is seen as a competition where profit is the highest good and where the austerity agenda is being rolled out. And I want to argue that, in actual fact, the crisis that we're living through now, that most of us in this room, I dare say, would say is an economic crisis, I would argue actually that it's not a crisis as far as this government is concerned. It's actually the opportunity that they've been waiting for, to cut spending permanently, to shrink the state, and to let inequality grow. They are, in fact, ideologically bent on dismantling the public realm, as if there were no alternative, whereas, in fact, there are big, radical alternatives. Free University Brighton is just one of them. There are similar initiatives that are being launched up and down the country. Many have been inspired by the tent city university that sprung up around St Paul's Cathedral during last year's Occupy camp. In Lincoln, there's a new social sciences centre set up by the local university's Dean of Teaching and Learning as a result of proposals to cut the teaching grants to arts and humanities and social science subjects. It charges no fees, but students can pay 1 hour of their income a month through PayPal. And at the end of 3 years of study, they're promised the equivalent of a higher education degree. In Liverpool and Leeds, similar projects have been set up. One called the Really Open University, in protest against the privatisation of our universities. And it's important to note that the founders don't see these new models as replacements for more traditional higher education. Rather, they want to make learning more accessible, especially lifelong learning, to those without the time or the resources to attend a formal course. Some universities are responding to this challenge themselves, for example, by putting materials online more. But the real benefits of the Free University is what it offers in terms of people meeting face-to-face in their local area and learning together. In other words, in enhancing the public good. And so the bottom line is that there are alternatives. These are more radical alternatives, but there are alternatives as well when it comes to funding our current university model. For example, a small business education tax levied on the top 4% of UK companies would generate enough annually to enable us to abolish tuition fees altogether and to increase UK investment in higher education. It's a proposal that's being put forward by the UCU and has been very well thought through. You might not agree with it, but it is an alternative, and it's an alternative that deserves to be debated, which is why I raised it in the House of Commons. There are other alternatives. We could raise corporation tax to just the G7 average. That would generate enough annually, as I say, to completely abolish tuition fees while leaving 96% of companies in the UK unaffected by the change, and also leaving the UK's main corporation tax still below that of France, Japan or the US. It would also acknowledge that we all benefit from students being educated to degree level and beyond. In other words, that this is about the public good as well as the private good. That the facilitation of inquiry and critical thinking and research contributes something to the public realm and the economy, as well as to the individual's development. So what we have today, I think, is a battle of ideas between education as a force for public good on the one hand and as a vehicle for private profit on the other. I started by asking what the future of higher education might look like. And that depends on which of those two ideas puts down the strongest roots, which captures students' and teachers' imaginations. It's easy to point the finger at who's responsible for the damage being done to our universities, much more difficult to stand up and stake a claim in doing things differently. And I think the importance of your meeting today and this conference is precisely about taking on that challenge to look at how things might be done differently. It's an important and a brave first step, and I'm very happy to be with you as you take it. Thank you.